Thanks for the chance to be here with everybody today. There has been obviously some big developments in our space. We've been anticipating them for quite a while, and it's really imminent. I think, as you mentioned, DOL unofficially gave us the new regulations text right before Thanksgiving. It was officially published on December 1st, and it goes formally into effect on January 30th. So this is now imminent in the sense that these new rules will take effect here in the next, 6 weeks, and then be governing thereafter. So let's jump on ahead here as soon as I figure out the buttons. I just want to spend a few seconds giving us a quick level set so we're on the same page about the context of how all this came up. The bottom line that we're all here for is that ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, governs the investment duties, among other things, of private sector retirement plans, which includes private nonprofits, but does not include public employees, either federal or state. So it covers a large swath of the American public, but not all of workers. But nonetheless, the ERISA guidelines are often seen as sort of best practices that are followed by a lot of other entities, even if they're not directly subject to it. But for many of you on this call, ERISA would be subject to how you're operating your retirement plans. And it established a pretty strict fiduciary duty. Courts have called it the highest duty known to law. And what it says is you have to act solely in the interests of the participants and beneficiaries for the exclusive purpose of providing benefits or defraying the reasonable expenses of the plan. So for a long time, one of the questions was, well, what does solely in the interest mean? What if there are any other types of additions or values or considerations that could result from an investment decision? Are we forced to avoid an investment because it has some of these, let's call them collateral benefits? Or as long as the investment is prudent and meets with ERISA's requirements otherwise, can you still go ahead and select that investment, and perhaps even because of those collateral benefits? And so this issue isn't new, but it is something obviously we've heard a lot more about in the last 2 or 3 years because of a whole series of events. The Trump administration changed the regulation. Talk about that in a second. The whole investing public has changed in many respects in wanting to consider, develop products and adopt sustainable investments. So you have a whole series of events that have changed it. But the reality is the Labor Department first addressed this almost 30 years ago. And back then we called them economically targeted investments instead of ESG investments, but the concept really was the same. And the Labor Department has put out guidance about 4 or 5 times over the intervening years prior to this new regulatory initiative. And even though it was different, and just to, in the interest of full disclosure, the 2008 guidance is guidance that I issued while I was running the agency. My background, in addition to being an ERISA lawyer by profession, advising mostly financial service providers, but also plan sponsors on complying with ERISA's investment requirements, among other things. I also ran the Employee Benefit Security Administration. I was the Assistant Secretary of Labor for Employee Benefits in the Bush administration from 2006 to 2009. And during that time, I put out one of these guidance documents that addressed ESG, what we still then called economically targeted investments. And even though the tone was different, in Democrat administrations, they were more encouraging of these considerations. In Republican administrations, we were a little more concerned about it, but we still agreed you could do it. Really, 3 main points came out. That yes, you can use ESG and other related features, provided you're putting your investments through an otherwise prudent, thorough fiduciary process. In other words, they have to be prudent investments. If they are, then they may have ESG features. That you can use ESG features to break ties among investments, and that no matter what, you can't purposefully select investments that are going to sacrifice returns or increase risks. So stripping away all the rhetoric, for 30 years, we had a fairly clear set of guidelines. Then that changed with the 2020 financial factors rule from the Trump administration. And just to briefly review a couple of its provisions, and it did technically go into effect back in January of 21. What that rule said is, no, any investment you pick under ERISA, you have to use only what they called pecuniary factors in this new test. And that while it would be okay if some non-pecuniary factors were present, you still had to pick an investment, one that was going to be on the core menu. So, for example, the 401k menu or the 403b menu would have to be selected for pecuniary reasons, but it could have these non-pecuniary aspects, unless you were using it as a default investment. So, if this was a qualified default investment alternative, like we would use an automatic enrollment and auto escalation, then the regulation said, yeah, you really can't use those investments there. And at the end of the day, what it did is, as the Biden administration said, is it created a lot of confusion and controversy. It's fair to say the Trump administration rule was motivated by largely political desires. It was motivated by a concern from their perspective that political opponents of theirs and labor unions and left-wing movements of various sorts would be trying to leverage ERISA pension assets, both through investment and through proxy voting, to achieve objectives that weren't really about retirement. And they really wanted to try and shut that avenue of resource off. That was really what motivated the Trump administration's rule. Unfortunately, they went a lot further than that in terms of creating some concerns. And so when the Biden administration came in, even though the Trump rule had not technically prohibited ESG investments, it had clearly put a chill on those investments. And on day one, the Biden administration put out an executive order directing DOL to review the rule. They reviewed the rule, and about 6 weeks later in March, suspended enforcement of the rule. It was still in effect technically, but DOL was no longer enforcing it. And they said that's because they found the new pecuniary test was confusing, which, by the way, it was. It would have applied to everything, not just ESG issues. And a lot of us sort of in the traditional ERISA space were concerned about how you would implement it. That it was chilling appropriate ESG investing. In other words, perfectly prudent, appropriate ESG investments were potentially being avoided as a result of the new regulation, and created this false perception that fiduciary risk was greater when you used ESG. So in March, they suspended enforcement of the rule, and in September of 21, they proposed the new rule. And here's where it got kind of interesting. The new rule that the Biden administration proposed back in 21 really was kind of beyond ESG friendly. It was actually ESG biased. So just as the Trump administration had singled out ESG negatively as sort of a special class of investments, and there's a lot of assumptions in there about why those aren't the right terms to use. I think it's how they thought of it. In many ways, the Biden proposal was the opposite. It was sort of singling out ESG for special favorable treatment. And it's had in there, for example, not a mandate, but language that said prudence, in other words, prudently following the process for selecting investments, may often require consideration of ESG related investments. And then they listed some examples of those investments. And I think one of the realities is the commenters who wrote in, even many commenters who fully supported ESG investing, said, we're a little concerned that this may not be as neutral as could be useful for having a rule that's going to have some longevity and be less of a political football. And then secondly, when you use examples in a regulation, they don't necessarily age well. They become kind of de facto rules. So if you identified, say, 3 different types of ESG things you ought to consider, those might become the only 3 things that are considered, and they might not fit 5 years from now as circumstances change. And so those were types of comments that were received. A small number of the comments to the proposal said, we're anti-ESG, don't woke our 401k, you're totally wrong to do this. A small number on the other end said, you're not going far enough, it should mandate ESG, retirement investing is long-term investing, the environment is a long-term issue, you should pull them together. I think most of the comments, though, were in the middle saying, we agree with you that ESG investing shouldn't be treated differently, but we think perhaps you should not have the examples and be a little more neutral in your approach. And I think that's exactly where the Biden administration ended up. This final rule, as far as sort of the political noise around this issue goes, really kind of ignores most of that. What it clearly says is, yes, you can, as fiduciaries, prudently consider ESG-related factors, and you can do so in 2 ways. First, you can say an ESG factor is a relevant factor to the analysis. So on the front end, you can say in determining whether this investment is prudent, One of the factors I look at is, for example, environmental impact. And that's important because it affects litigation risk and regulatory risk and all of those other factors. This is an upfront relevant consideration. In securities parlance, you would say it's a material consideration to evaluating this investment. So the first way is fiduciaries now have the authority under the regulation to consider any relevant factor, including ESG factors. The second way you can use them is as they have traditionally been used, which is to say, if you have otherwise prudent investments, in other words, investment options that have gone through your fiduciary screening process and have come out the other end. Let's say you were looking for a large cap fund and you screened 20 investments and 4 of them met your criteria. You could use ESG related factors or any other what they called collateral benefit factors to decide among those investments, to pick one of the 4 that were prudent, that what they call equally serve the financial interests of the plan. Now, this is an important one to understand. Equally serve the financial interest of the plan is not the same as saying they're identical investments, because, well, frankly, no 2 investments are identical. That was standard in the past that wasn't very helpful. What this says is if investments are going to equally serve the financial interests of the plan, in other words, they're equally prudent, they're equally intended to fit the same niche. So in the example I used, these are large cap funds, and I've screened them all, and now I'm selecting from among the winners of that screening process. I can use these collateral benefits like ESG factors when they're not relevant to the analysis, when they're not material. I can still use them to break ties. It also cleared away any problem against using ESG investments for default investments. So plans are now free to use the normal QDIA regulations, the normal rules about how you select an investment for automatic enrollment. That can have ESG features. In general, just this final rule is neutral with respect to ESG. It says that you may consider it as you could any other factor. The pecuniary test is eliminated. And in many ways, this is what's really, legally at least, consistent with the history of ERISA. Generally speaking, the government has not picked winners and losers among investments. Generally speaking, that's been the job of fiduciary. And this regulation, I think, is, in the end of the day, actually quite consistent with that history. The last thing I want to say before I stop filibustering here and we let somebody else make some good points is that DOL is not acting in a vacuum. As you all know, there are other regulations pending, and 2 in particular at the SEC, which we may well see come out in the first part of next year, really are going to have an impact as well. So DOL has said, yes, retirement plan ERISA fiduciaries, you may consider ESG where you determine it's relevant. You may use it on the front end, you may use it on the back end to make these decisions. But what the SEC is going to say is we need some rules of the road about what some of these terms mean. And so investors will have more clarity about funds and how they work. And they've proposed 2 rules, one that would, and I'm vastly summarizing here, so any security lawyers in the crowd, feel free to correct me, but they're basically saying we're going to divide these types of investments into buckets based on their intentions. So we have, for example, integrated ESG investing, where typically you're using those ESG factors as part of an array of factors to help analyze investments, and that measures that sustainability, for example, as part of the efficacy of those companies in getting return on investment in performing into the future. At the other end, you have impact investing, where the goal of the investment really is to achieve that objective, perhaps even more so than some of the financial benefits. How the SEC defines those buckets is going to spill over into retirement plans. Because if I'm a prudent fiduciary and I'm evaluating ESG related investments, it's going to be very difficult to find that an impact investment, which is prioritizing, for example, achieving the environmental result over prioritizing the financial result, that's going to be very difficult to find that that's prudent for ERISA purposes. So the integrated bucket should be no difficulty at all. The other end, the impact bucket, might be quite difficult. So how the SEC defines these terms could have a direct impact on retirement plans. The second one is they're looking at making some amendments to what's called the names rule. And in a nutshell, it says if you call the fund the X fund, 80% of the investments have to be about X. So how do you apply that in practice to ESG issues, for example, is something that regulation is going to struggle with. and they got a lot of comments. They finished the proposal. We're waiting for the final. And where the SEC comes down on both these rules will also have an effect on us in the ERISA retirement plan space. So with that, let me stop and give someone else a chance. And again, say thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about all this new and exciting stuff that's going on.